Chapter 1. Balashi twisted and turned fitfully in his sleep. Amon had been alarmed when the night wore on, and his parents failed to return from the temple. It had been necessary for Balashi to wrestle him bodily into his bedchamber to force him to go to sleep, and something of the boy's disquiet had lodged in the back of Balashi's mind and disturbed his rest. He turned over and tried to banish the thoughts that swirled around in his head, but just as he was finally slipping into sleep, he thought he heard a noise. His eyes snapped open, and he came fully awake, his heart beating quickly, his muscles tense. He held his breath and listened, but the sound did not come again. He rolled over and tried to go back to sleep, but a nagging something wouldn't let him rest until he assured himself that all was well. He stood up from his sleeping pallet and stepped silently from his place in the anteroom to peek through the doorway into the prince's chamber. Amon Shaw was sleeping heavily, his chest moving regularly up and down. Satisfied that all was well, the bodyguard went back to his pallet to make sure that his heavy bronze dagger was where he could easily reach it, then lay back down. Just as the straw in his mattress stopped rustling, he heard something again. It was very quiet, but it was clear enough to be unmistakable. It was the scuff of a sandal on the tile floor just outside the door. Balashi lay quietly, holding his breath, listening intently. He could just make out the hushed susurration of whispering voices. As silently as he could manage, Balashi rolled from his bed to the ground. He laid his face flat on the floor and looked through the crack beneath the bottom of the door. There were 4 sandaled feet standing just outside. He snatched up his dagger, levered himself to his feet and stepped into the prince's room, pressing his back to the wall on the left of the doorway. No sooner was he in place than the door to the antechamber crashed inward with a tremendous crack, as the wooden lock bar snapped like tinder. A brief bob of his head to check the anteroom showed Balashi a pair of spears stabbing through the mattress of his bed. Then, the 2 men were rushing into the prince's room. Balashi stepped in smoothly behind the first man, stabbing his dagger just below the thick leather breastplate the man wore into his unprotected left kidney. Then, he was twisting and pulling the weapon out, but not before the heavy spear from the other man came swinging at his head. Balashi dodged and simultaneously brought his left arm up to protect his face. The razor-sharp bronze of the spearhead passed within inches of his right eye and sliced into the flesh of his forearm. Balashi flung the spear wide, ripping the spearhead from his arm as he did so, then stepped forward, trying to close the distance and nullify the reach advantage of the spear, even as the spearman stepped back. A thrust with the spear skewered the air where he had been a moment before, but he had already dodged to the side. He had to quickly sidestep another thrust, and then the spearman was momentarily distracted when a pillow struck him in the side of the head. Taking advantage of the distraction, Balashi dove forward, rolled, and came up with a sharp dagger thrust. The spearman dodged to the side, narrowly escaping being disemboweled, but when he took another step back to put distance between himself and Balashi, his feet twisted up in a heavy blanket, and he staggered. Balashi's next stab pierced flesh, and then it was just a matter of finishing off the 2 mortally wounded men. "A blanket?" Balashi asked, with a clear note of disappointment in his voice. "It was the best I could do on short notice," Amon told him, as he put down the pillow he had been readying for another throw, if the first pillow and the blanket he had tossed proved insufficient. "Where is the spear that I've told you 60 times to keep by your bedside?" "It rolled further underneath the bed when I tried to grab it," Amon admitted. "Climb under the bed and get it," Balashi instructed, in a no-nonsense tone. "What's going on?" Amon's muffled voice asked, as he retrieved his spear. "Who are these men? How'd they get in here, and where are the household guards?" Balashi shook his head. "I don't know," he said, "but something is amiss." He went into the bedroom, snatched up one of the assassin's spears, then returned to the anteroom where he belted on his sheath. He slipped his dagger into the sheath, and then checked that Amon was holding his spear properly before he stepped toward the hall. "Stay close to me," he told Amon. He was craning his neck around the corner to look down the hallway when he felt Amon's hot breath on his nape. He turned to look at the prince in annoyance. "Stay a bit further behind me," he hissed in a low whisper. "You said stay close," Amon whispered back. "Is that blood?" he asked, as he noticed dark streaks running down Balashi's forearm and dripping to the floor. Balashi looked at his arm in irritation. Suppose I'll have to see to that first. He handed his spear to Amon and rummaged around for a cloth to bind up his arm when a loud scream echoed off the walls. Amon rushed into the hallway as Balashi hissed at him as loudly as he dared to come back. He dropped the bandage he had been trying to tie one-handed and hurried after his heedless young charge. He had just thrust Amon behind him when he noticed the unmistakable sounds of battle coming from somewhere inside the palace. There was another loud cry of pain, followed a moment later by a shout of triumph. Amon turned to look at Balashi in concern, a question on his lips, when the sound of sandaled feet racing down the hallway behind them caused them both to spin and point their weapons. But it was only Dumuzi, the king's personal bodyguard, rushing from the king's chamber, dressed in his full armor. "What's going on?" Amon asked him as he thundered past. "The king has been slain!" Dumuzi called. "The palace is under attack! Armed men are inside! Get the prince to safety!" Balashi grabbed Amon by the arm and dragged him back into his room, used the spear to improvise a replacement for the smashed wooden lock bar, then went to the back corner of the prince's chamber and pulled up the hinged false tile. He released the catch on the trap door, swung it open fully, and then began to climb down the ladder. Amon hesitated only a moment before he came over as well, and waited for Balashi to descend. He grasped the bronze handle and pulled the trapdoor closed above them. "He's wrong. Dumuzi is wrong. Father can't be dead," Amon asserted as they climbed down the ladder. "Right or wrong, the palace is under attack," Balashi called back in a low voice. "So keep your mouth shut and move quietly, or the two of us will surely be killed." After they had gone through several twists and turns that took them into a little used storeroom, Balashi was blindly searching by touch for the catch that opened the entrance to another secret tunnel, when a terrified serving girl burst in and saw them. She looked as if she had been fleeing from someone, for her clothing was disheveled and she was out of breath. Perhaps she had been looking for a place to hide. When she saw two men lurking in her chosen hiding place, she started to cry out, but barely had the first squeak escaped her lips before Balashi clamped his hand over her mouth. He whispered a few words in her ear, waited for her to nod her agreement, and then let her go. She raced away, presumably to find another spot to hide. Amon let himself be led down the low earthen tunnel and out another trapdoor. The two of them had just left the heavy copse of pine trees where the tunnel from the palace emerged when they bungled directly into a group of 3 armed men who were out combing the palace gardens. Balashi, who had already been carrying his spear at the ready, was able to mortally wound the first man before his sword completely cleared its scabbard. The second and third men got their weapons free and paired off against Amon and Balashi. Amon was suddenly glad for the couple of hours he had spent drilling that afternoon. He sized up his opponent as Balashi had taught him, and saw that the man outweighed him by at least 3 stones, and that he held his sword as if he knew how to use it. He decided that his best chance was just to use his spear to keep the other man at a distance, while Balashi finished off his man, but Amon wasn't the only one who had been taught to size up his adversary. His opponent, noticing his advantage in size and weight, and concluding that Amon's youth meant that he was unlikely to know how to handle his weapon, decided to make a quick bull rush. Amon stepped back to set his spear butt into the ground in order to meet the charge, but he tripped over a root and went down, accidentally losing hold of his spear as he fell. The flying spear tangled in the legs of his onrushing attacker, and the man fell in a heap on top of Amon. Quick as a cobra strike, Balashi's spear licked in and out again, piercing the fallen man's side. As Amon worked to roll the dying man off of him and get back to his feet, the third attacker rethought his strategy and turned tail to run. Balashi let him go and helped Amon to his feet. "How many times have I told you to make sure of your footing in a battle?" Balashi asked. "This fellow will testify that if you lose your feet in a fight, you're as good as dead," he added, pointing his spear tip at the man who had fallen on Amon. "I can't help it that I stepped on a hidden tree root," Amon shot back. "Good fighters feel where they're stepping before they put their full weight on a foot," Balashi told him. "Good bodyguards handle assassins themselves, so that the prince they're hired to protect doesn't have to think about his feet in a fight," Amon replied. "Quietly," Balashi hissed. "Why did you lead me out here?" Amon demanded, though at least he lowered his voice. "The fight is in the palace. We need to find father." My job is to protect you, Balashi answered, deciding to leave the topic of the death of the king for later. But, Amon started to object. We'll talk about it later, after I get you someplace safe, Balashi insisted firmly. He paused for a moment, as he tried to decide just where he could take the boy that whoever had attacked the palace would not have thought of first. At last, he made up his mind, and led Amon out to the rural rim of Eridu, then along a series of narrow trails and neglected country roads until at last they ended up at a mud hut on the outskirts of town. Amon could scarcely believe that this hovel could be their final destination, but Balashi entered the house, spoke with someone inside, stepped outside just long enough to beckon urgently to Amon to follow, then let out a long breath and settled himself into a corner. A peasant woman, her face seamed and wind-burnt, had been tending to a smouldering fire of burning goat dung. As Amon tried to find a place to sit in the dark hut, the woman shocked him by placing a hand on each cheek and saying, in a scarcely intelligible low-born accent, "Oh, you poor dear. Your father dead and you hunted like an animal. Oh, what you must be going through." Then she pulled him into an embrace and stroked his cheek. Amon pulled away in surprise, his sudden reaction unbalancing the woman so that she fell to the floor. Amon stood looking at her, unsure how to react. Balashi helped her to her feet and glared at Amon, who pretended not to see. He clamped a hand in a bronze grip over Amon's arm and dragged him to a corner of the small hut. "We are guests here," Balashi told him in a low voice. "Treat this woman as you would your own mother as long as we are beneath her roof." "Oh, Enki," Amon replied, as he dropped his head into his hands. "What has happened to my mother, my sisters? Can it be true that father is really dead?" Balashi patted him awkwardly on the back. "Dumuzi would not have said it if it were not true." "Why is this happening?" Amon asked tearfully. "Has Enki turned his hand against my family?" "This is the doing of men, not the gods," Balashi answered. "It must have something to do with the things we were discussing yesterday. All the comings and goings of important men, both openly and in secret, can only mean that something big is afoot. No one would have dared move against your father without the backing of many of the rich and powerful, not only in one of the nearby cities but also in Eridu." Amon did not reply, but only sniffed miserably. "Come away, leave the boy for a moment," the woman said softly to Balashi. "Yes, what is it?" Balashi asked. "You've been injured," she said, pointing to Balashi's forearm. "I haven't the proper herbs here, but it needs to be cleaned and bound at the least." She got a clean cloth and wiped away the blood and grime before binding it up. "Thank you for that, and for taking us in," Balashi said quietly. "You know you are welcome to stay here for as long as you need," Mushazebti replied hesitantly. "But you must realize that you and the boy will stand out like a pair of sore thumbs. If you trade your rich clothing for worn wool, no one would say anything." She trailed off. When Balashi did not say anything, she repeated herself. "If you were to put on fraying wool, no one would take any notice." Balashi understood what she was trying to tell him. "You mean that even in poor clothing, the boy will still stand out?" he concluded. "His skin is too light and his hands are too soft," Mushazebti said. "He looks as if he hasn't done a day of honest work in his life," Balashi interpreted. "On top of that, his manner of speech and his imperious air will stand out, at least as much as his looks." Mushazebti nodded, but did not say anything more. "We've already put you in danger by coming here," Balashi said softly. He shook his head. "We'll only stay as long as we must. I'll come up with a plan and we'll leave your home by tomorrow." "It need not be so soon as that," Mushazebti objected. "If you keep the boy inside—" "No, I won't intrude on your hospitality when it puts all of our lives in danger," Balashi replied. "It'll be best for all three of us if we move on quickly." In the morning, Balashi awoke Amon early. "We need to do something about our clothing," he said. "I will go to the market and buy woolen tunics for us." Amon made a face, but he did not object. He hated the way that wool felt against his skin, but if they wanted to blend in, he couldn't very well go about town in his linen nightclothes. "Well, what are you waiting for?" Balashi asked, as he held out his hand. "What do you mean?" Amon wanted to know. "Give me your clothes," Balashi demanded. But I haven't anything to change into, Amon pointed out reasonably. Nor will you have anything to change into until I sell what we have and buy something new. You want me to go naked, like a slave, while I wait for you? Amon asked incredulously. Slaves aren't the only ones who have to go naked from time to time, Balashi said dryly. And, unless you happen to have stashed a few silver shekels in your pockets as we left the palace, I will have to sell your clothes to buy new ones. But it isn't proper, Amon objected. What if the woman comes back before you do? I will be back long before Mushizebdi returns from the fields for her midday meal, Balashi assured him, with amusement in his voice. But even if I'm not, what of it? What of it? Amon echoed in outrage. She might see me. And? Balashi persisted. Are you dense? Amon asked angrily. She might see me. She's raised 3 sons. Believe me, you don't have anything that she hasn't already seen thousands of times before, Balashi told him unsympathetically. It isn't proper, Amon repeated, his face turning red. Well, then to soothe your sense of propriety, I promise that I'll be back before the midday meal, Balashi told him. But perhaps, before I leave, we should speak of our plans. What do you think we should do? Amon asked. Balashi sucked his teeth in consideration. There are certain leading families of the city which have the resources to take back the palace, he said. But no one would have attacked the palace in the first place without the support of at least some of the powerful families. So how can we know which of the families are involved in the plot and which would support you? Amon asked tentatively. It was the High Priest of Enki, wasn't it? Balashi understood what he was asking. Yes, I think he must have been involved in the scheming which resulted in the death of your father. He's a very ambitious man, and if your father was attacked at the temple, as I am sure he must have been, then the High Priest had to have been complicit. That must be why your father insisted you stay home. But why did father go to the temple if he suspected that something might happen to him? Balashi shook his head. I don't know. Maybe he heard from his spies that someone was plotting against him, but he didn't suspect that the High Priest was involved, Amon hazarded. That makes sense, Balashi allowed. I would not have suspected Lipetenki was capable of such vile treachery. The gods hate treachery above all other crimes, and the High Priest has not only broken his oath to your father, he has broken his oath to Ar as well. Priests are forbidden from spilling blood. What's more, he killed your father after having broken bread with him in his own house dozens of times. That is the worst possible violation of guest right. How could he dare to do this thing, when not only your father's kin, but Ar and Ishtar as well will all turn their hands against him? Maybe he believes that another god will protect him from their wrath, Amon said slowly. Maybe he's a member of that secret society they say worships some dark god and feasts on the flesh of children. That is just a story mothers tell children to frighten them into obedience. There is no such secret society, Balashi said dismissively. Then how could Lipetenki have dared to attack my father in the temple? Amon demanded. There must be some reason, Balashi insisted mulishly. Perhaps he thought your father had lost the support of Ar. Enki, Amon corrected. Ar is what barbarians call him. Father is a good man. Why would Enki turn his hand against him? I don't know, Balashi admitted. Can you think of nothing he might have done? Amon thought about everything his father had said or done recently. He had always been scrupulous in his observance of the proper sacrifices and rituals. However, there had been that time when Lipetenki and father had quarreled at the temple. Balashi noticed the change in Amon's demeanor. Have you thought of something? He asked. Amon did not reply immediately. He was trying to recall the details of the quarrel. It must have been 3 years ago, during the Feast of Waters. Father had been drunk, as was his custom on feast days, and the High Priest of Enki, even drunker than father, had approached him during the play. Father had been intent on watching Mother, as she enacted the part of Inanna when she took the sacred May from the sleeping Enki. It was his favorite part. The priest had interrupted him, asking pointedly about something from the play, but father had brushed him off. The priest had been insistent, and father had said something disparaging to shut him up. Amon hadn't heard everything they discussed, but the high priest had suddenly stood up, and there had been a semi-coherent argument that ended when Lipetenki swore that Enki would surely cut father's line short for his blasphemy. At the time, Amon hadn't thought much of it. The priest had many times demanded control of the sacred May given to the kings of Eridu by Enki, and the most powerful of the May was the fruit of the Tree of Life. "I think Lipetenki was jealous of father," Amon said at last. "Surely," Balashi agreed. "The royal palace is far superior to the temple, and your father controls more fertile land than the temple as well." "No, not just his wealth and power, I mean his long life." Balashi looked thoughtful. "I thought the long life of the kings of Eridu was an exaggeration, a tale left over from days long past." Amon shifted uncomfortably. "We're not supposed to talk about it," he said. "Father said that there was already more than enough to encourage men to point their covetous glances at the king of Eridu, even without knowing the truth of the rumours. Anyway, it isn't like in the old stories, where my ancestors Alulim and El Algar ruled for 64,000 years, but father says common men don't live beyond a span of 50 or 60 years. "And how long do the kings of Eridu live?" Balashi asked. "I don't know for sure, but father said that his father's father has been king 3 different times, alternating trips to somewhere else with spans of ruling the kingdom. He took a different name each time he took the throne." "And Lipetenki knew of this?" Balashi asked. "I don't know," Amon admitted. "But he was always demanding that the sacred May Enki gave to my fathers be placed in the temple of the Lord of the Deep Waters. Father refused him. Lipetenki was never allowed to taste the forbidden fruit, nor to drink the sacred waters of the Abzu beneath the palace." Balashi's eyebrows shot up. "There's a pool of waters beneath the palace?" Amon clammed up, recognizing that he had said too much. "Your secret is safe with me, I'm unsure," Balashi assured him. "Believe me, it's not the only secret of your family that has been entrusted to me over the years." "You promise you won't mention this to anyone, will you?" Amon pleaded. "We aren't supposed to talk about it." "I swear by Ishtar's pearls that I will tell no man," Balashi said solemnly. "But if what you say is true, it would certainly explain why Lipetenki wanted to take control of the palace." "Once, when he was in a drunken rage, he also swore that Enki would cut father's line short," Amon added. "Worse and worse," Balashi replied. "Such an oath is even more binding upon a priest than other men." He looked at Amon intently. "What?" he asked. "If the high priest meant what he said, if he did not repent of his oath but instead stood by it, then surely he will stop at nothing to end your father's line." "By killing me?" Amon asked. He visibly paled. "Last night, I thought that I might go to Enmen Luana, my uncle. He would take me in, I'm sure of it. He would not be involved with the traitors. But then I realized that, as you said, Lipetenki would not have dared to attack the palace and overthrow the king if he was not sure of the support of most of the houses. Anyone who takes me in will be in grave danger." "I'm sure that Lipetenki will have the support not just of most of the noble houses, but the army as well," Balashi agreed. "The army?" Amon asked. "Are you certain?" Balashi shook his head. "I am not certain, but it makes sense. The army is made up of a levy from each of the houses, and not the best from the houses either. The low men of the army have ever been very susceptible to the lure of silver. I doubt the high priest of Enki would have bothered himself with the common soldiers of the army, but if he cared to, he could buy them off easily enough. He certainly will have bought off some of the key officers, if not the general himself." "I had decided that running to General Rish Shamash would be the best plan," Amon replied, a bit desperately. "To go to my uncle would bring the weight of all of the traitors to bear against him. I thought that the general, well, even with all the levies coming from the different houses, he has forged them into a single brotherhood, loyal to the king and to himself. The general knows me and would follow me." Balashi snorted. "A single brotherhood, eh? A brotherhood of plunder, I might believe, but nothing more noble than that. The general and his officers, though, that's another matter." Balashi considered for a while. "I think it not worth the risk," he said at last. "General Rish Shamash is an ambitious man, and a pious one. He has a reputation for making extravagant offerings to Ar after his battles." Amon thought a moment, and realized that this was true. He recalled his father grumbling about the largesse that had been given to the temple, when the sickly goats and skinny, gap-toothed slaves given to the king had smacked of stinginess. The general's generosity with the best slaves and cattle had been interpreted as piety, but it could just as well have been the basis for a series of bribes paid to the high priest, Lipetenki. Rish Shamash was well respected, and was now considered a superior man, though he had once been a common soldier. What might he have been promised for an alliance with Lipetenki? Land and titles, certainly. Perhaps something more? The general has a son and 2 daughters of marriageable age, Amon said speculatively. Balashi nodded. There have been rumors that he is seeking matches above his station. Amon sighed. What can we do then? His voice breaking on the last word as he struggled to maintain his composure. What indeed? Balashi replied. Are we planning for survival or revenge? Amon considered. Revenge, he said at last. Lipetenki cannot steal all that I have in the world, then live to a ripe old age, even if it is only 50 or 60 years, as he sits on the bones of my father. Balashi got a faraway look in his eyes. Sometimes revenge is best left for the gods. Your family is called the beloved of Enki. If that's so, will Enki not pay back this priest for his treachery? There are places in the north we might go, places where keeping a pet prince might stroke the vanity of an ambitious nobleman. I will be no man's pet, Amon responded fiercely. Nor will I run like a whipped dog with my tail between my legs. Very well, Balashi replied evenly. Where shall we get an army to cut down Lipetenki before he takes root in the palace? Amon thought. Are the household guards all dead, do you think? Balashi tipped his hand this way and that. Maybe not dead. The soldiers entered the palace somehow, and that most likely means silver was paid to a traitor. Maybe a lot of silver paid to several traitors, but most of the guard would not have wanted to risk their lives on the chance of a palace coup. The fighting we heard in the palace means that some, maybe most, of the guards remained loyal. Likely they would have fled when the cause was lost, or when they heard the king was dead. Can we find them, do you think? Amon asked. Some, maybe, but not enough to fight Lipetenki directly. Balashi thought for a time, and then asked, What of Uruk? Amon considered the idea. Uruk was another great city of the plains. In the distant past, Uruk had been a rival and frequent antagonist of Eridu. The Urukai spoke the same language and worshipped the same gods. They nominally all served the same Akkadian emperor, though that mainly just amounted to tribute and occasional levies of soldiers. Eridu and Uruk were allied now, with frequent trade caravans passing from one city to the other. Urukai cloth had a particularly tight weave, and the nightclothes Amon had left to him were of Urukai linen, a much finer and more comfortable fabric than wool. The leaders of the city of Uruk might indeed be willing to take up Amon's cause against the traitors, but they would not do so out of the goodness of their hearts. If Amon went to them and won back his throne, he would become a puppet king, a tool to be used at the whim of the Urukai. They would surround him with their men, allow him only advice from their counselors, and he would pay tribute to their king. That line of thinking prompted another thought. There were men of Uruk who came to my father not 2 weeks ago, he said. You don't think that they could have been involved in this plot? Who can say? Balashi replied. But if we go to Uruk seeking help, what if we end up asking the very men behind the plot for aid? It is a risk, Balashi agreed. If not Uruk, what of Akkad? Amon made a face. The Sumerians had ever considered their northern neighbors to be barbarians, even after Sargon, the gardener-turned-emperor, had conquered the kingdoms of the south. The kings of the south never mentioned the emperor if they could help it, preferring the euphemism of sending supplies north to ever stating the bald fact that they paid a hefty tribute to the emperor. What would the emperor think of a priest assassinating a liege lord? Amon asked himself out loud. I suppose he might be persuaded to intervene, Balashi said. How is the relationship between the emperor and your father? Amon tried to remember what his father had to say about the emperor. Father had to travel to Akkad each year to pay the tribute personally and renew his oath of allegiance. He had even taken Amon with him several times, though not in the last few years. Father grumbled about paying the tribute, but I can't recall him ever saying anything about the emperor personally, Amon said at last. So? Balashi asked. What would you like to do? I must believe that Lipetenki has been planning my death and that of my father for a long time, and from what I know of the High Priest, I can be certain he was very thorough. I think that I must seek help outside of Eridu. Uruk is not so far as Akkad, and it's on the way. We could try our luck in Uruk, and then continue on to Akkad if things don't work out. Balashi suspected that if things didn't work out in Uruk, their bodies would feed the jackals outside the city, but he kept this particular insight to himself. "All right, Uruk it is," he said, with forced hardiness. "The next thing to decide is how we ought to enter the city. We don't want anyone to know that the Prince of Eridu is there, obviously. We will need to go slowly, seeking out reliable allies and keeping our ears to the ground to listen for rumors of treachery." "I know," Amon said brightly. "We can act the part of an olive merchant and his bodyguard. With all that we learned about olives yesterday, I think we could play the part well enough." "The best thing to do is stick as close to the truth as possible," Balashi argued, doing his best not to scoff. The fact that Amon thought that he could learn all there was to know about the olive business in a single brief afternoon only served to highlight just how sheltered the life the boy had led up until this point had been. Amon tried again. "What if we play the part of a scribe and his servant? You can fetch me clay and reeds, and I'll keep accounts for merchants, or perhaps write down holy words for the priests." "How good is your writing?" asked Balashi thoughtfully. Then he shook his head. Never mind, it won't work anyway." "Why not?" asked Amon. "Because scribes are among the most jealous form of human putrescence known to man," he answered. "They form their little guild clubs, and they never let anyone who isn't one of their heirs learn anything of their arcane arts. They guard their knowledge so closely that no one but another scribe can even decipher their scratchings. How do you think they're able to charge so much for their services? No." Balashi shook his head again. "If an outlander were to come into their city without the protection of some great lord, then he'd suffer a fatal accident within a week. Anyone attempting to start a business without first joining the guild would get a knife in the back on his first night in the city." "So we'll join a guild," Amon countered. "With what guild fee? You have some shekels hidden somewhere in that tunic that you haven't told me about?" Balashi asked evenly. "What then?" Amon demanded in irritation. He had thought that the scribe idea was a good one, though, to be honest, he hadn't been as diligent at keeping up his writing skills as he should have been. Making all those tiny little triangles in the clay was hard, and it set his head to spinning if he kept at it for too long. "We must think how to explain why you look differently from other men. You're recovering from an illness, maybe. That would explain why you're so pale," he said thoughtfully. "I don't want to play the part of an invalid," Amon objected. "And anyway, didn't you say it's best to stick close to the truth? Maybe I ought to be the son of a wealthy noble looking for some new business contacts in the city." They continued in this fashion for some time, with Amon coming up with different possible scenarios, and Balashi finding fault with every one of them. "The day is wearing on, and I still have to get us new clothes," Balashi said in frustration. "We'll decide our cover story as we go. I need to get to the market." So saying, he once more held out his hand imperiously, and waited for Amon to remove his linen nightclothes before he stalked out the door, leaving Amon to shiver in just his breechcloth.